Welcome to another episode of the podcast for the Chicago Midwest chapter of the Turnaround Management Association. I'm Jack O'Connor, an attorney at Sugar Felsenthal, Grace & Helsinger LLP in Chicago, and in this episode we're bringing you clips of the audio from our recent joint event with the Commercial Finance Association featuring a discussion of the role of U.S.-imposed tariffs and their economic effects for professionals in the distress space. The panel was moderated by Candace Klein of Carpenter, Lips & Leland LLP and featured panelists Suzanne Yoon of Kinsey Capital Partners, Robert Shapiro of Thompson Coburn, Lisa Gelsomino of Avalon Risk Management, and Thomas Klyer of the Federal Reserve of Chicago. If you'd like to learn more about the TMA, you can do so by visiting our chapter website at turnaround.org/Chicago Midwest, and you can connect with us on social media through LinkedIn, Facebook, or by following us on Twitter at Chicago TMA. We hope you enjoy the podcast, and without further ado, let's get right into it.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Nick Miller. I'm a partner in the Bankruptcy and Restructuring Group at Neil Gerber and Eisenberg. I'm the president of the Chicago chapter of the TMA, and this is great. We're really pleased to have a joint event here with the TMA and the CFA. But the main event today is our panel on tariffs. I'm very interested in hearing what they have to say, but I'm going to turn it over to Candace Klein, who's our moderator, and she can tell us a little more about our panelists and what we have in store for today. So, Candace.
Excellent. Thank you, Nick. So clearly tariffs got your attention. This is a wonderful level of attendance for an educational lunch on such a dry and fascinating subject such as tariffs and international trade. Thank you again to both the TMA and the CFA for organizing this event. We have a wonderful panel. I'll introduce our panel. You'll see we bring a lot of experience, so think of good questions. This is an opportunity for some free consulting. We're going to provide some background on tariffs and how we got here, and then we're going to talk about the impact of the tariffs. This is the impact on companies, it's the impact on our global system, it's the impact on, for example, the automotive supply chains. And then we'll have some final remarks and some Q&A. Now, we brought with us a lot of material. So we're going to try to do a little bit of a march through it all. So stick with us. Of course, we'll be talking right through your lunch. Thank you for all courtesies there. I will introduce our panel. Suzanne Yoon. She is the founder and managing partner of Kinsey Capital Partners. She oversees all facets of the firm's investment activities, fundraising, and operations. She has nearly 20 years experience working firsthand with middle market companies in various capacities, investing and advising. Also noteworthy is that she participates in civic and pro bono board service and does that here in Chicago and has obviously been involved with many of the organizations you know, including the TMA, the ABI, and WAVE, the Women's Association of Venture and Equity. So thank you very much, Suzanne, for joining our panel. We then have Robert Shapiro. And Robert is a partner with the firm of Thompson Coburn. He joins us from Washington, D.C., and you'll find why that's appropriate because he heads the firm's international trade practice and faces off against Customs and Border Protection, the U.S. Department of Commerce, the U.S. International Trade Commission, the U.S. Department of State, the Federal Maritime Commission, the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, and the United States Congress. So Robert's bringing a great deal of experience in the trenches working with tariffs and the agencies on behalf of his clients. We then have Lisa Gelsomino, and Lisa is the president and CEO of Avalon Risk Management. She is based here in Chicagoland, and she hails from Chicago, has degrees from Northwestern and Northern Illinois, and she's going to talk to us about insurance and surety and customs broker issues related to the practical aspects of dealing with these tariffs and customs. Lo and behold, you need a bond. So we'll be talking a bit about that. And then we have Thomas Clyer, who is a senior economist and research advisor with the Federal Reserve of Chicago. He has done a significant amount of research with regard to automotive supply chains and the effects of changes in manufacturing technology, the spatial distribution of economic activity, and regional economic development. Thomas Clyer has been with the Fed since 1992 and is very widely published. And, you know, some of his publications focus on the automotive industry might be of interest to you because many of you probably touch the automotive industry, given where we are having this lunch. And that's going to talk about, for example, NAFTA production, NAFTA supply chains. We'll touch on that here, as well as the future for the auto industry. Now, many of you, if you're reading the news, including Cranes and the Wall Street Journal, will have seen that we are probably in a trade war. So what does that mean, right? Well, Caterpillar got a feel for what that means, which was a stock drop on Tuesday. They closed down 7.6%. 3M closed down. Harley-Davidson closed down. Fastenal closed down. So what was Caterpillar saying? So Caterpillar said, okay, with tariffs, we have increased costs. We have a view to increase our prices. Increase costs. Third quarter, $40 million from the impact of the recently imposed tariffs. Full year impact of the tariffs is at the low end of the range, 100 to 200 million for the year that they had forecasted. These are hundreds of millions. I can say the same thing for 3M. I can say the same thing for Fastenal. And that Caterpillar is notifying dealers to increase their prices 1 to 4% worldwide. Now, they give this reassuring view. Well, manufacturing costs were higher due to increased material and freight costs. Material costs were higher primarily due to steel prices and tariffs, but never fear. In the fourth quarter, higher prices and spending discipline, meaning cutting costs, are expected to more than offset the rise in material and freight costs. So with that, as you see the corporate earnings announcements as they're dealing with changing their operations, you're managing some top line impact, you're also managing some bottom line impact. And the question will be, how does that resolve on net? Okay, so tariffs, bad reputation, pros and cons, but not a new phenomenon. And so the question that you should wrestle with here today is good, bad, indifferent. How do we view these tariffs? Is this a means to an end or is this the end? You'll see a lot of coverage in the press. I mentioned both Cranes and Wall Street Journal. That's constant, but also the Donald J. Trump Twitter feed, right? Tariffs are the greatest. So it gets obviously a lot of attention in the press. This is from The Economist. So if you think about tariffs as being like little monster piranhas tearing at both Uncle Sam and U.S. industry, that's certainly what they were trying to portray. But also the other thing about this cartoon is that once you unleash these little piranha monsters, can you get them back in the cage? What is the ramification of launching with this kind of a trade negotiation strategy? So as Nick had mentioned, we have our Janet Yellen event, the Executive Speaker Forum with TMA. That is November 15th, and our moderator is Kai Risdahl. And Kai Risdahl is the senior editor and lead journalist for Marketplace, which is a drive time NPR program. You can listen to it on WBEZ 91.5 at 6:30 or 7 o'clock in the evenings. And starting back in April of 2018, in his Twitter feed, as well as on the program, they were asking, are we in a trade war? Are we in a trade war? What do you want to hear about this? And so Marketplace has been a wonderful resource for coverage of trade and timely interviews, but also responding to questions by listeners such as Larry Garfield. Has a trade war ever worked out in anyone's favor? How often? What happens? And that's one of the points that we're going to raise today. So with all of that, obviously, we've talked a lot about politics. So I'm going to turn this over to Suzanne, and if you can give us some background as to how did we get here?
So at Kinsey, we invest in lower middle market companies and consumer and manufactured products, so about 3 to 15 million of EBITDA. So we've had to become essentially tariff experts overnight. And we spend a lot of time studying it and trying to understand how it's going to impact our gross margins as well as price elasticity in all of our companies. And so we thought we've done a lot of work on what the political really instigators have been, and I think there's a number of things, right? There's the notion that China has been stealing IP from around the world, and is the U.S. going to stand up for ourselves and everyone else? And who's going to do it if it's not the United States? I think there's that component. I think there's also a component of making sure that we have more fair trade terms, which Trump has used against in his NAFTA, clearly against with Canada and Mexico and Europe. And I think a big driver for him is that 25% of the GDP historically in the United States, it used to be 25% of the GDP was manufacturing, and today it's 10%, and that's equivalent to about a 10 million jobs lost over a period of time with manufacturing moving overseas. And I think that's probably also a very big driver for wanting to bring manufacturing back in the United States. And I'm going to kind of go through a few stats that are not up here, but just to kind of level the playing field and so that everybody understands. But in 2017, we had a $375 billion trade deficit with China. So we imported $505 billion worth of goods from China. China imported $130 billion from the United States. So that's really where the trade, I think, where we felt, I'm sure, the leverage really came from is being able to impose tariffs on products. So it started with steel and aluminum. It then, at the end of May, Trump announced 25% tariffs on approximately 50 billion of product, and then an additional 10% on 200 billion in July. And the 10% on the 50 billion went into effect at the end of July. 10% on the 200 billion went into effect in late September. Another 15%, so raising that 10% to 25%, will go into effect, according to DC, at the end of January, January 2018, unless there is some agreement that we come to some type of agreement with China. So, and I'm sure Robert will go more into the Trade Expansion Act and the Trade Act of 1974 and how Trump was able to, the administration was able to impose these tariffs. But one thing I wanted to note was, it was interesting, the Senate actually had a vote in early July, and it was a non-binding resolution. So they actually voted to say we can bring a law to the Congress floor to basically that would require the executive branch to get a congressional vote to impose tariffs. So they didn't actually vote on that, but there was a really strong message that was sent to the president, and it was, I believe, 88-11 in favor of this message or this resolution, which said most of the Congress and the United States was not in favor of the tariffs. That was in July. He still increased the tariffs. I mean, they still went into play. So there's, I think it's a little bit of a, we don't really know how, and I think that this is the biggest issue for investors and lenders and everyone else here, is what he is going to do, how far this will go. And I think the biggest question is what's going to happen between China and the U.S. And this also isn't on here, but I think it's something to keep in mind. You have a president of a country that has no political pressure, with a very nationalist country behind him. And so, I think we're all under kind of this could escalate to a much bigger than 25% tariffs across all of our products. We just don't know where it's going to go.
Right. So we have a great deal of uncertainty, but also this desire to protect certain U.S. industries. So Robert, could you start taking us through these various sections and actions, starting with the protective ones?
So the trade war, like any war, you have protective actions to protect what's at home, and you have aggressive actions. So in the protective actions, we traditionally have ways of putting in additional duties on items that are being unfairly traded in the U.S. And those have been matter of course. They're going on all the time. They're called anti-dumping, countervailing duties. There's also safeguard measures, which are when goods come into the country in such a vast quantity that wasn't anticipated in the trade agreements that you can then give the U.S. industry a chance to recover and to adapt to those changes. And those are the safeguard duties, and we do those periodically. Under the Trump administration, we had safeguard duties imposed on solar cells as well as washing machines. So that were two safeguard duties. The other one is this 232, Section 232 under the Trade Expansion Act of 1964. This is a piece of legislation that hasn't been used in a very long time. And what it is ability to put in duties to protect industries that are important for national security. So we're protecting the national security of the United States. And it's a rather broadly worded statute. And in fact, it's being challenged at the Court of International Trade on whether Congress could actually delegate such broad base of authority to the president. And that's sort of goes into the resolution that Suzanne mentioned. So under Section 232, we decided that the steel and aluminum industries were critical to the national security of the United States and needed protection, and have put duties in place of 25% on steel and 10% on aluminum. The price of steel domestically has gone up about 30% as a result of this, a similar rise in the price of aluminum, and that relates back to the Caterpillar, Ford, Harley, and all those other steel consuming industries and what the pressures are seeing because of those duties. We're also doing an investigation on whether the auto industry is a national security interest and needs additional protection, and that decision will come out sometime in February, and we may put additional duties on auto parts.
And I just wanted to add to that, what's interesting about the steel and aluminum tariffs, with the price increases in the United States, there is oversupply of steel and aluminum now in China. So the cost of manufacturing in China actually went down slightly, which was not, I don't think, intended,
right. But the other piece on the steel and aluminum tariffs is they didn't hit China. Because most of Chinese steel and aluminum is subject to these anti-dumping and countervailing duties that we talked about. So it's already priced out of the U.S. market. It had the biggest impact on Europe and Canada and our close allies. So that's one of the disconnects on using a national security measure to protect this. The theory being that there's an oversupply of steel and aluminum in the world market, a lot of it in China. China was sort of blocked from the U.S. market coming in to make goods in Europe, and the action and Canada, and the action was try to get Europe and Canada and the rest of the world on the same page with the U.S. on going against China in its steel and aluminum industry. A lot of what we're looking at is really the trade war against China, but since we don't import a lot of steel and aluminum directly from China, we're doing it against other countries.
Okay, so Robert, so you talked about China a lot and trade war with China. So they're not necessarily Section 232. So what are they?
So we have another section of the law, Section 301, which is a traditional statute that is used to give the president leverage in negotiating trade agreements. This is under the Trade Act of 1974. It hasn't been used a lot since the WTO was enacted because we had other mechanisms to go that way. But this administration used 301 to go after China because of concerns, I think generally considered legitimate concerns that China was not playing fair, especially with regard to intellectual property. And so we started out with $50 billion worth of duties, goods that were being imported and put 25% duties on, as Suzanne mentioned. Those came in 2 tranches, and then we increased that to another $200 billion worth of goods that duties were imposed in September. And then we have
The total today is 250.
the total right now is 250. And the latest thought is probably after the midterms, duties will be imposed on the remaining 257 or $267 billion worth of imports from China. So the president seems fairly fixed on going after all the Chinese goods.
Okay, so focus is on China. So Suzanne, why don't you take us through the tariff targets for that first 50 billion?
And we haven't updated these charts for the 200, but they're very similar. I think the theme of this, and I'm not going to go through every detail, is that a lot of this is in consumer. So it's really going to affect really the end consumer. There's a lot of component parts that go into consumer goods and direct consumer goods. So everything from appliances to component parts that go into Apple. I mean, there's discussion about, is Apple really worth $1 trillion if you believe that they're going to be
One thing, because they actually haven't put it on many of the end consumer goods that come from China. This first tranche went after manufacturing goods.
But the 200 billion.
No,
is
very
actually-
few, didn't get a lot of consumer. The remaining 257 is all the apparel, like in the 200 billion, they removed Bluetooth headsets, they removed smartwatches, they removed a lot of consumer goods that would have been, created a problem, I think, in the midterms.
But the component parts that go into those consumer goods that affect the end manufacturing or they actually are taxed, so it's affecting almost every margin of every company that you're probably going to see in some facet or another, whether it's a component part or the end good. And in the 200 billion, actually one of the biggest sectors that is in the consumer space that's being taxed is appliances. Almost all appliances, like refrigeration, almost all of it is made globally is made in China. So actually, there is a lot of like necessary consumer goods where price elasticity is pretty important for those industries, and they'll end up and they are being taxed. So I think that's basically, so that's the U.S. version, and then where we see China striking back, they don't have as much to strike back on, but I think you hear this a lot. The farmers are not happy because of the soybean tariff. Right, back to China. So you'll see, it's soybeans, aircraft, cars, so a little more similar, some of the things that they are creating component parts for, then probably purchasing back into China.
Okay, so let's continue the theme on impact. We have a China problem. So now we have tariffs. We also see some retaliatory activities. How does that impact the U.S.?
So we actually did an analysis on red states versus blue states, and oddly what we found, because you would think Trump, right, he's a Republican, he's on the Republican mission, the main industries that are in fact affected by the tariffs so far, so the 250 billion, are metals, food, and consumer goods. And when we looked at the significance in the red states, versus, so I'm going to I think this slide, and then if you flip to the next slide, this is the impact on the blue states. So it actually impacts the red states more than it does the blue states, which I also think is interesting. This is not a party, I would say if the party were to be driven only by its economic motives, I don't think that the tariffs would be, which is seen by the Senate or the Congress, the congressional vote that happened back in July.
Right. We'll just point out that Illinois is number 2 on this graph for impact on blue states following California. So the local exposure is reasonably significant for the tariff policy.
And I would say Texas is impacted as California, like on a dollar for dollar basis. I mean, you have Texas is probably is either the largest or the second largest. Has the second largest impact from the tariffs.
Okay, so now we have retaliation. So perhaps if we start with you, Suzanne, and I think Robert and maybe Thomas, you have some additional views on the retaliatory measures that have been taken across the globe.
Well, it's been interesting. Many countries, this is. A lot of countries are retaliating to the U.S. because the steel and aluminum tariffs affect everyone, and then China, of course, is its own retaliatory effort. One of the interesting things that many countries have done is target things that are politically sensitive. So we're seeing the soybeans, obviously, from China. The European Union's going after bourbon because a certain senator in Kentucky. We see Harley Davidson attacked because of a certain congressman in Wisconsin, and same thing with cranberries out of Wisconsin. So a lot of the retaliatory tariffs have been really to try to influence the politics, the domestic politics, and make sure that there is that the pain is that they try to hit on pressure points in the retaliatory tariffs.
And I think also from a tactical standpoint, the things China is making difficult, right? And we've seen this in the news, but holding up licenses for US-based businesses in China, making it more difficult just to do business in China in general. The delaying of mergers and acquisitions approvals involving US companies. Everyone saw Qualcomm died because the Qualcomm NXP deal died because China wasn't on board and they got everybody else on board. Bain Capital had a huge delay in their Toshiba deal. They ultimately got it approved in May of 2018, but I wonder if it had lagged into July or August, if they had actually would have gotten that approved. And then I think one of the other things we have to be concerned about is just the ramping up of American products. So we know that they are making, ramping up of the inspection of American products. So we know, as an example, like cherries and pork, it is getting harder to import because the inspections are getting more difficult. And it's a huge export item for the U.S.
And you mentioned the treasuries. One of my other concerns would be China has a monopoly, essentially, on rare earth minerals, which are used to make high-strength magnets that we need for efficient motors and other things. So right now, we haven't imposed tariffs on these magnets, and China hasn't restricted those exports, but that could be something that would have a squeeze on both of our industrial base and our military industrial base. So those are other retaliatory efforts that remain in the wings. We have other actions that we're taking against China also in restricting Chinese investment into U.S. companies in order to further protect U.S. technology. And that's Congress enacted new legislation this year to give additional power to the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States to further restrict Chinese investment.
Well, thank you, everyone, and thank you to our panelists for joining us today and providing us all this wonderful insight. Okay. Great. Well, many of us will still be here, so if you have a question, feel free to look us up.